Perhaps the greatest illusion of modern life is not that people are afraid of being alone, but that they spend years convincing themselves that they are. So they keep searching. Searching for someone to message, someone to love, someone to fill the quiet spaces that seem to follow them wherever they go. But the silence never truly leaves. It lingers beneath the noise of everyday life, waiting patiently beneath conversations, entertainment, and endless distractions. And sooner or later, everyone is faced with an uncomfortable truth. The desire for another person is not always love. Sometimes it is an attempt to escape ourselves, an attempt to avoid the fears, insecurities, and unanswered questions we have never learned to face. The Stoics understood a truth that remains just as uncomfortable today as it was centuries ago. A person who cannot find peace in their own company will eventually expect others to carry emotional burdens they were never meant to bear. They begin to expect relationships to provide purpose, validation, security, peace of mind. But these are things that cannot be given from the outside. They must be built within. The more we depend on others to make us feel whole, the more vulnerable our sense of freedom becomes. And without even noticing it, many people slowly begin to lose themselves in that dependence. Not all at once, but little by little, until they can no longer tell the difference between who they truly are and who they have become in search of acceptance, reassurance, and belonging. Most people believe the hardest part of being single is simply not having someone there. The empty chair across the table, the quiet room at night, the messages that never light up the screen. But in reality, these are not what truly disturb the mind. What unsettles people runs much deeper. It is the moment when everything around them goes quiet, when distractions fade away, and all that remains is their own mind. Because the real fear is not being alone. It is finally being alone with yourself. In that silence, there is no escape, no noise to hide behind, no activity to look away from what the mind is thinking. A person can spend years surrounded by people, conversations, entertainment, and constant stimulation without ever truly meeting themselves. Life becomes packed with responsibilities, tasks, messages, and endless streams of information. Every pause is quickly filled. Every quiet moment is avoided. Until one day, everything stops. The distractions disappear. The phone goes silent. The television is off. The world no longer demands attention. And suddenly, there is nothing left except the thoughts that have been quietly waiting underneath it all. In that moment, silence feels heavier than expected. And that reaction reveals something deeper about us than we often realize. Human beings are incredibly skilled at keeping themselves busy. The moment a free second appears, it is quickly filled. Another video, another notification, another conversation. On their own, none of these things are harmful. The issue begins when constant stimulation slowly becomes a way to avoid reflection. Many people move from one distraction to the next, not because every moment brings joy, but because stillness asks something from them. It asks them to listen. And in that silence, the mind begins to surface questions that have been delayed for months, sometimes years. Questions about life's direction. Questions about decisions that were never fully examined. Questions about whether the goals being chased are truly their own. Instead of facing those questions, people often reach for something to silence them. The discomfort fades for a while, but the questions do not disappear. They remain underneath the surface, quieter perhaps, but still present. And over time, the more they are avoided, the less familiar a person becomes to themselves. This pattern rarely feels obvious. It hides inside ordinary routines. People often believe they are simply being productive, staying connected, or staying informed. And on the surface, that seems completely reasonable. But productivity turns into avoidance when it leaves no space for self-reflection. Connection becomes avoidance when it replaces understanding of one's inner world. Even information becomes avoidance when it is consumed endlessly without pause, without reflection, without meaning. The problem is not activity itself. It is the intention behind it. A person can stay busy all day, moving from one task to another, yet still feel a quiet emptiness following them everywhere they go. That emptiness is often misunderstood. People assume it exists because something is missing in their lives, so they begin searching. A new achievement, a new experience, a new relationship, something that might finally make the feeling go away. And for a short time, it seems to work. But eventually, it returns, quietly, unavoidably, because the truth is simple. Emptiness that comes from neglecting the self cannot be filled with external things. It does not need more distraction. It needs attention. It does not need escape. It needs honesty. But honesty is difficult because it forces us to face parts of ourselves that do not always match the image we like to show the world. The Stoics understood this very well. They believed that a person should examine their own mind with the same seriousness they use to examine everything else in life. Instead of running from discomfort, they encouraged turning toward it. Instead of treating difficult emotions as enemies, they saw them as signals, information meant to be understood. Socrates captured this idea perfectly when he said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." This path requires courage, because self-examination strips away many of the stories people rely on to protect themselves. Excuses start to lose their strength. Blame becomes harder to hold on to. And what is left is a clearer, more honest view of who we really are, including the habits, patterns, and fears that quietly influence our lives. For many people, the fear of being alone is not really about solitude itself. It is the fear of this inner meeting. Solitude removes all the usual distractions. There is no crowd to follow, no outside voices to lean on, no constant opinions shaping your thoughts. In that space, the mind becomes more visible to itself. At first, this can feel uncomfortable. Old regrets that were buried begin to surface. Unfinished goals come back into focus. Long-suppressed insecurities quietly reappear. This is the point where many people turn back to distraction, because it feels easier than staying present with themselves. But every escape reinforces the same belief, that there is something inside that must be avoided. Over time, that avoidance only makes the silence feel heavier. Over time, our relationship with solitude begins to change. Being alone no longer feels like proof that something is missing. Instead, it slowly becomes a space where something neglected can finally be rebuilt. Attention, once scattered across endless distractions, starts turning inward. A person learns to sit with their thoughts without immediately trying to escape or fix them. They learn to observe their impulses without being controlled by them. And they begin to understand a deeper truth. Peace does not come from avoiding discomfort, but from understanding it. What once felt like emptiness slowly reveals itself as open, unexplored space. And within that space begins the foundation of real self-awareness. There is a quiet freedom hidden inside this shift. When a person stops treating every uncomfortable feeling as something to run from, they begin to regain control over their own inner world. They stop relying on constant stimulation to feel okay. They stop expecting others to carry them through boredom, uncertainty, or emotional discomfort. Instead, they develop the ability to remain stable in their own presence. This stability does not appear suddenly. It is formed through repeated moments of honesty, patience, and awareness. But once it begins to grow, solitude no longer feels threatening, because the person who is alone is no longer unfamiliar to themselves. If these ideas help you see your own mind more clearly, consider subscribing to continue this journey inward. The work of self-examination never truly ends, and every step toward awareness brings a deeper sense of freedom. From a young age, most people are quietly introduced to a story so common that it rarely gets questioned. It appears in movies, music, advertisements, family conversations, and everyday remarks that seem harmless on the surface. The message is simple. Life is moving toward a destination, and that destination is often framed as finding someone who completes the picture. Because this idea arrives early, most people never pause to examine it. It becomes part of the background of life. Success begins to look a certain way. Fulfillment begins to look a certain way. Even happiness starts to take a familiar shape. Over time, what begins as a cultural idea slowly turns into an expectation. And expectations quietly shape how people interpret their own lives. This influence shows up in subtle ways. A person may achieve their goals, build a career, develop skills, and create structure in their life, yet still feel that something important is missing. That feeling does not always come from reality itself. Often, it comes from the belief that life is supposed to follow a specific sequence. When someone measures their life against this inherited script, even natural differences can feel like personal lack. The issue is not human connection itself. Connection is meaningful and deeply important. The problem arises when it becomes the main measure of personal worth. At that point, being alone is no longer neutral. It becomes something that needs to be explained, fixed, or avoided. And this pressure rarely appears directly. It works quietly in the background. Through questions from relatives, comments from friends, and comparisons shaped by society. And through constant exposure to social images and expectations, the same message is quietly reinforced again and again. Without realizing it, people begin comparing themselves to a standard they never consciously chose. They look around and assume that everyone else has figured something out that they are still missing. This creates a constant inner urgency. Instead of asking whether a relationship truly aligns with their values, they start asking whether they are falling behind in life. And that shift changes everything. Decisions are no longer guided by inner clarity or self-trust. They become driven by the fear of missing milestones that others appear to have already reached. From this environment, the need for validation naturally grows. People are trained to look outward before looking inward. Attention starts to feel like proof of importance. Compliments start to feel like proof of worth. And acceptance starts to feel like proof of belonging. None of these things are negative on their own. The problem begins when they are no longer seen as additions, but as necessities. A person who depends entirely on external validation becomes fragile because their sense of self constantly changes based on things they cannot control. As Epictetus once suggested, if you want to grow, you must be willing to be misunderstood. Praise can build confidence. Criticism can break it. Approval can bring peace. Rejection can take it away. Slowly, the center of stability shifts outward, no longer grounded within the individual, but placed in the reactions and opinions of others. This becomes especially powerful in relationships because relationships provide immediate emotional feedback. They offer reassurance, validation, and a sense of significance. But when identity begins to rely on those responses, a hidden vulnerability is created. A person slowly loses touch with their own judgment. Instead of asking what they truly think, they begin asking what others think of them. Instead of asking what aligns with their values, they begin asking what will preserve acceptance. At first, the compromises feel small and reasonable, almost harmless. But over time, these repeated adjustments slowly begin to shape how a person understands themselves. What starts as a desire to belong gradually turns into a desire to conform. The Stoics warned about this because they understood how easily external pressures can take control of the mind. They encouraged people to clearly distinguish what truly belongs to them and what does not. Reputation does not belong to you. Approval does not belong to you. The opinions of others do not belong to you. But character does. Judgment does. Choice does. And this distinction quietly changes everything. Instead of building identity on unstable ground, a person begins to build it on internal principles. Outside validation is no longer treated as proof of worth. It becomes simply information, something that may or may not be useful, but never defining. At first, this shift seems subtle, almost insignificant. And in the beginning, it can even feel like responsibility. After all, people are taught to cooperate, to adapt, to consider others. These are not weaknesses. They are necessary parts of human connection. No meaningful relationship can exist without them. But there is a fine line between adapting and erasing yourself, between compromise and surrender. And that line becomes harder to see when acceptance starts to matter more than authenticity. Slowly, a person begins filtering their thoughts before expressing them. They avoid certain goals because they might create discomfort or conflict. They suppress instincts that once felt clear, simply because following them might disappoint someone else. As Marcus Aurelius reminded himself, never value anything as profitable to yourself which shall compel you to break your promise or lose your self-respect. Gradually, the mind becomes more focused on preserving comfort than pursuing truth. What begins as a way to maintain connection slowly turns into quiet self-censorship. Many people try to solve this feeling by changing their external world. They assume the issue is their job, their environment, or their circumstances. And sometimes, those factors do play a role. But more often, the deeper issue is something else. It is not a lack of opportunity. It is that a person has spent so long adjusting to external expectations that they no longer recognize what they truly want. Their attention has been pulled outward for so long that their inner voice becomes faint. And when that voice finally speaks, it often shows up not as clarity, but as restlessness, a quiet, uneasy feeling that something is missing, without any immediate understanding of what that something actually is. The Stoics placed great importance on protecting inner freedom because they understood how easily it can be given away without even realizing it. They knew that external forces are constantly trying to shape how we think. Approval, criticism, praise, fear, status, and social pressure, all of them compete for control over the mind. But the real challenge is not to eliminate these influences. The real challenge is to stop them from deciding who you become. A person remains truly free when they can participate in the world without being defined by it. They remain free when their principles are stronger than their need for approval. They remain free when they can endure temporary discomfort without betraying what they know is right. But this kind of freedom is rarely tested in extreme moments. More often, it is tested in ordinary life. It is tested when honesty feels inconvenient. It is tested when silence feels easier than truth. It is tested when pursuing something meaningful requires disappointing the expectations of others. These moments may seem small on the surface, but they quietly reveal something important about character. Every decision teaches the mind what it should value. Every repeated action strengthens a habit, either of self-trust or self-doubt. A person who repeatedly ignores their own judgment becomes more dependent on outside direction. But a person who consistently honors their principles develops a stability that is much harder to shake. And this is often where people begin to notice their own patterns. They remember moments when they ignored their instincts just to be accepted. They remember goals they delayed because they feared judgment or criticism. They remember situations where they chose approval over honesty and later felt disconnected from themselves without fully understanding why. But these memories are not meant to create guilt. They are meant to create awareness. Because reflection is not about self-punishment. It is about understanding. And once a pattern becomes visible, it begins to lose its control. What once happened automatically now becomes something you can choose differently. There comes a point where avoiding yourself becomes more exhausting than simply being present with yourself. Most people reach that point without even realizing it. They spend years moving from distraction to distraction, believing that the next experience, the next achievement, or the next source of stimulation will finally bring relief. But that relief never stays for long. The mind calms for a moment, and then begins searching again. Underneath that constant restlessness is a deeper discomfort, one that cannot be solved by more activity because it is not asking for entertainment. It is asking for attention. This is where solitude enters the picture, and it is often misunderstood. Solitude is usually seen as something to avoid, associated with loneliness, absence, or isolation. But being alone and feeling lonely are not the same thing. One is a physical state. The other is an interpretation of that state. A person can feel lonely in a crowded room and completely at peace while sitting alone. The difference is not about who is present around them, but about their relationship with themselves. The challenge is that silence has a way of revealing what noise can temporarily hide. When distractions fade away, thoughts that were pushed aside begin to return. Old regrets resurface. Unresolved emotions reappear. Questions that once felt distant suddenly come closer. At first, This can feel uncomfortable because the mind is no longer busy avoiding itself. It is finally being asked to face what has been there all along. Many people mistake this discomfort as a sign that solitude is harmful. But often, it is actually a sign that something important is being uncovered. The first experience is similar to walking into a room that has been left untouched for years. Dust has gathered. Things are out of place. Nothing feels organized. The natural instinct is to walk away and close the door again. But the state of that room does not change through avoidance. It only changes when someone stays long enough to understand what needs attention. The same truth applies inwardly. Avoidance delays clarity. Awareness creates the possibility of change. The Stoics understood this deeply. They believed in regularly examining the mind, not to criticize it, but to understand it, actions and motivations, because they believed something essential. A person cannot live wisely without first understanding their own mind. But this was never meant to be an exercise in self-criticism. It was always an exercise in honesty. They understood that clarity begins to appear the moment we stop running from uncomfortable truths. What feels overwhelming from a distance often becomes manageable once it is faced directly. And much of what we call fear is not rooted in reality itself, but in uncertainty. As this inner process continues, solitude begins to take on a different meaning. What once felt like punishment slowly starts to resemble a mirror. And a mirror does nothing except reflect what is already there. The same is true of being alone. It does not create insecurities, doubts, or fears. It simply brings them into view. And although that can feel uncomfortable, it is also deeply valuable, because nothing can be changed until it is clearly seen. Awareness, in this sense, becomes the beginning of freedom rather than a source of distress. And something subtle begins to happen when a person stays with that reflection long enough. The mind slowly becomes less reactive. Thoughts still arise, but they no longer control immediate action. Emotions still appear, but they no longer dictate every decision. A space begins to form between impulse and response. And even though that space may feel small, it changes everything. It creates the ability to respond with intention instead of reacting automatically. It opens the door to acting from principle rather than passing emotion. This shift is rarely sudden or dramatic. There is no single moment where everything suddenly becomes clear. Instead, the change is quiet and gradual. A person notices they no longer need constant distraction. They become more comfortable with silence. They start trusting their own judgment instead of constantly seeking reassurance. Moments of solitude that once felt unbearable slowly become restorative. The mind feels less crowded because it is no longer resisting every thought that arises. Over time, a deeper stability begins to form. External life continues to shift. Success on some days, disappointment on others. But the individual is no longer fully dependent on those changes for inner balance. They develop an internal reference point. As Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Silence begins to feel like understanding. Reflection begins to feel like insight. And what was once avoided starts becoming something essential. This is the hidden strength of solitude. It requires patience before it offers clarity. It requires honesty before it brings peace. Because real strength is not built through distraction or validation. It is built through the willingness to stay present with oneself. And as that willingness grows, silence changes. It is no longer an empty space to escape from. It becomes a place where understanding deepens, character strengthens, and a person gradually realizes something profound. The presence they were searching for was their own all along. And eventually, a deeper realization arrives. Independence is not just about living alone. It is not about avoiding relationships or proving self-sufficiency. It is something far deeper. It is the ability to remain steady, no matter who comes into your life and no matter who leaves it. Many people believe they are independent because they handle their responsibilities, make their own decisions, and support themselves financially. Yet emotionally, they often remain tied to the reactions of others. A simple compliment can lift them higher than it should. A rejection can hurt far more than it needs to. On the surface, life may look stable, but internally, their state is still influenced by things outside their control. This is why staying single can become such a powerful period of growth. It removes many of the places where dependence quietly hides. When there is no partner constantly offering reassurance, attention, or validation, a person begins to notice how often they relied on those things. At first, this awareness feels uncomfortable. The mind naturally reaches for familiar comfort. It wants to feel valued, wanted, understood, and important. And without those constant signals, long-buried insecurities begin to surface. But this is not a sign that something is wrong. It is a sign that something hidden is finally coming into view. Most people spend years developing their ability to handle external responsibilities while giving little attention to their internal emotional world. They learn how to solve problems, meet deadlines, and fulfill obligations. But when loneliness appears, they immediately try to escape it. When uncertainty arises, they seek reassurance. When self-doubt shows up, they look for someone else to quiet it. Over time, this becomes a subtle form of dependency that feels normal simply because everyone around them is doing the same thing. When a behavior is common, it rarely looks unusual. It just becomes part of life. Solitude interrupts that cycle. Without constant emotional reinforcement from others, a person is gently forced to find a different source of stability. They begin learning how to sit with discomfort without immediately reacting to it. They realize that emotions do not always require action. They understand that anxiety can exist without controlling their decisions. And they see that loneliness does not have to turn into desperation. As Seneca said, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality." But these lessons cannot be fully understood through ideas alone. They must be lived. They appear through repeated moments of patience, awareness, and reflection. Over time, a quieter form of emotional independence begins to develop. Not coldness, not detachment, but understanding. Understanding that your emotional foundation belongs to you. Other people can support you, enrich your life, and share meaningful experiences with you, but they cannot carry responsibility for your inner balance. That remains yours alone. The moment this truth is accepted, something begins to shift. Relationships stop feeling like lifelines and start feeling like choices. And with that shift comes a different kind of freedom. When validation is no longer a necessity, the pressure to constantly seek approval begins to fade. A person becomes less focused on managing how they are seen and more focused on living truthfully. They stop shaping every decision around how it will be received. They stop measuring their worth through other people's reactions. This transformation does not happen overnight. Years of conditioning do not dissolve quickly. But every moment of self-trust slowly weakens the need for external validation. Every act of honesty strengthens the ability to stand on one's own judgment. And most people never realize how much energy is spent on validation. It appears in countless small ways. The need to be accepted by everyone, the need to avoid criticism, the need to prove worth through achievement, attention, or recognition. These patterns feel normal only because they are so widespread. Yet beneath them, something deeper is always waiting to be seen. They place a person's inner peace in unstable hands. Approval can be given, and just as easily taken away. Praise can quickly turn into criticism. Public opinion shifts constantly. And building self-worth on something so changeable creates a life filled with quiet instability. The Stoics offered a different way of seeing this. They encouraged people to focus only on what truly belongs to them. Their choices belong to them. Their character belongs to them. Their actions belong to them. But the opinions of others do not. Reputation does not. Outcomes do not. The idea sounds simple, but living by it requires real discipline. It means letting go of the belief that external approval can provide lasting security. It means accepting that peace comes from mastering what is within your control, not chasing what is not. As this understanding deepens, solitude begins to change its meaning. Being single no longer feels like something missing. It starts to feel like an opportunity. The space that once felt empty becomes meaningful. It turns into a place where self-respect is built through action, not applause. a place where personal values are tested without outside influence. Slowly, a person begins to trust their own judgment. They learn that uncertainty can be endured. They learn that discomfort does not need to be escaped. And most importantly, they realize that their worth does not have to rise and fall with circumstances. A quiet strength begins to develop through this process. It is not loud or visible. In fact, it often goes unnoticed by everyone except the person experiencing it. They know they can handle solitude because they have already lived through it. They know they can face rejection because their identity is no longer dependent on acceptance. They know they can sit with uncertainty because they no longer demand guarantees from life. Their confidence becomes rooted less in outcomes and more in character. And ironically, this is often when relationships begin to improve as well. A person who no longer depends on validation is able to connect more honestly. They are less likely to accept disrespect out of fear of being alone, less likely to abandon their values just to maintain approval, less likely to lose themselves inside someone else's expectations. They enter relationships not from emptiness, but from wholeness. Connection becomes an addition to life, not a rescue from it. The deeper truth is not that everyone should remain single. It is that no relationship can give a person what they refuse to build within themselves. Independence is not separation from others. It is ownership of your inner world. And once that ownership is established, everything changes. Companionship becomes richer, choices become clearer, and life becomes less dependent on approval and more guided by principle. And gradually, peace becomes more stable. The constant search for validation starts to lose its power because something more reliable has taken its place. A person begins to trust their own thinking. They learn to manage their own emotions, and they carry their sense of worth from within, rather than borrowing it from outside approval. This is a kind of freedom that no external circumstance can easily take away. And something subtle begins to shift when a person stops structuring their life around the expectations of others. At first, the change feels almost invisible. Nothing about the outside world changes. The same responsibilities remain. The same environment continues. But internally, there is now more distance between outside influence and personal judgment. Decisions no longer need to pass through the filter of approval before they are made. The mind becomes quieter because it is no longer constantly occupied with managing how it is perceived. Many people do not realize how much mental energy is spent simply trying to control impressions. Once that weight begins to lift, attention slowly returns to where it actually belongs. Instead of asking how every decision will be seen by others, a person begins to ask whether it is right for them. And this small shift creates a level of clarity that is difficult to reach when validation is always required. Clear thinking needs space from noise. It needs time to understand before reacting. But modern life often moves in the opposite direction. Opinions arrive instantly. Reactions arrive instantly. Judgments arrive instantly. People are pushed to decide what they think before they have fully understood why they think it. Solitude, even temporary solitude, interrupts this pattern. It creates room for independent thought. The mind becomes less focused on agreement and more focused on truth. And although this difference seems small, it changes the quality of every decision that follows. There is a reason many philosophers, writers, inventors, and thinkers throughout history have often chosen solitude on purpose. They understood something simple but powerful. Original thought rarely grows in the middle of constant distraction. Creativity needs space. Not just physical space, but mental space. Room for thoughts to breathe, develop, and take shape before they are shaped by outside influence. A mind constantly reacting to external demands ends up in a state of interruption. One idea is replaced by another before either has been fully understood. Solitude slows this cycle down. It allows curiosity to deepen instead of scatter. It gives attention enough stability for insight to form naturally. And this benefit is not limited to creativity alone. Personal growth follows the same pattern. Growth requires observation. It requires the willingness to see weaknesses without being overwhelmed by them, and to recognize strengths without becoming dependent on them. But when a person spends too much time seeking approval, their self-understanding becomes distorted. They begin to see themselves through the lens of other people's opinions. Identity slowly shifts from inner truth to external perception. The real danger is not criticism itself. The danger is losing the ability to judge yourself honestly because your attention is constantly directed outward. Solitude creates space to rebuild that inner clarity. It encourages a person to rely on self-reflection rather than constant validation. At first, this process can feel uncomfortable because honest self-examination rarely brings immediate comfort. It exposes habits that need attention, assumptions that need questioning, and patterns that need awareness. But discomfort is often a sign that something is changing. The Stoics understood this deeply. They did not see difficulty as something to avoid at all costs. Instead, they recognized that many essential qualities are formed through resistance. Patience is built by facing impatience. Discipline is built by resisting distraction. Wisdom is built by questioning what seems obvious. Real growth rarely exists inside comfort alone. As a person becomes more familiar with their own mind, confidence begins to take a different shape. It is no longer rooted in achievement, recognition, or approval. It comes from knowing that your actions align with your principles. This kind of confidence is quieter than what society often celebrates. It does not depend on constant reassurance, and it does not collapse when circumstances become difficult. Instead, it becomes stronger through consistency. Every decision made from conviction, rather than pressure, strengthens a person's sense of integrity. Every action taken because it feels right, not because it looks impressive, builds deeper trust in oneself. And this trust becomes essential because life constantly presents opportunities to compromise. Not every compromise is harmful. In fact, many are necessary. The real challenge is knowing the difference between flexibility and surrender. A person without a strong connection to their own values often struggles with this distinction. They adapt so often to external expectations that they slowly lose sight of what they actually believe. Their life becomes reactive. They move from one demand to another, adjusting constantly without ever asking whether the direction itself is truly theirs. Standing alone interrupts this pattern. It creates space where decisions can be observed before they are made. And over time, something subtle but powerful begins to happen. The need to impress others starts to fade. Goals become more personal. Choices become more intentional. And success is no longer defined by recognition, but by alignment with one's own values. A person begins building a life based on what they genuinely care about, rather than what receives the most approval. This does not mean rejecting others or ignoring different perspectives. Wisdom often comes from listening to many viewpoints. The difference is that those viewpoints no longer hold ultimate authority. They become information, not instructions. The final decision remains grounded in personal judgment. There is a quiet freedom in this way of living. Energy once spent managing how others perceive you becomes available for meaningful action. Attention once scattered across expectations becomes focused. The mind feels less crowded. Thoughts become clearer. Priorities become easier to recognize. Progress becomes more fulfilling because it is tied to authentic direction rather than borrowed ambition. The individual is no longer trying to become who others expect them to be. They are becoming who they consciously choose to be. And perhaps this is one of the greatest benefits of learning to stand alone. It creates the conditions for genuine growth. Not growth measured by status or admiration, but growth measured by understanding. A person begins to see what truly matters and what only once held their attention. They learn the difference between living by conviction and living under pressure. And once that difference becomes clear, the direction of life naturally begins to shift. The path may not always become easier, but it becomes more honest. And there is a quiet kind of peace in building a life that reflects your own values rather than the expectations of everyone around you. After enough time alone, a deeper realization often appears. What you were searching for was never another person. It was stability. It was clarity. It was the feeling of being at home within your own mind. For a long time, people try to find these things externally. They look for certainty in relationships, confidence in approval, and peace in circumstances they cannot control. Sometimes these experiences bring comfort. Sometimes they even bring happiness. But many people still believe that the next relationship will finally resolve their doubts, fears, or loneliness. Yet no relationship can carry that responsibility forever. A relationship can offer love, support, and companionship, but it cannot permanently heal what originates within. The individual still brings their own fears. They carry their insecurities, habits, and beliefs into every relationship they form. And if those remain unexamined, they quietly follow them everywhere. The Stoics saw this with great clarity. They believed that the quality of a person's life depends far less on external circumstances and far more on the state of their inner character. This was never about ignoring the world. It was about understanding the correct order of things. Inner stability comes first. Everything external comes second. When this order is reversed, a person ends up in a constant search for something outside themselves to provide what only inner understanding can create. And that search never truly ends, because the real cause is never addressed. As this understanding deepens, the idea of being single begins to lose its emotional intensity. It is no longer seen as a problem that needs immediate fixing. At the same time, relationships stop being seen as achievements that automatically bring fulfillment. Both states become neutral. They become experiences, not identities. The focus shifts away from relationship status and towards something more essential. The real question is no longer, am I alone or with someone? It becomes, am I living in alignment with myself? And that shift changes the meaning of love itself. Love is no longer a rescue from loneliness. It is no longer an escape from uncertainty or emptiness. Instead, it becomes a conscious choice made from inner strength. Because there is a clear difference between needing someone and choosing someone, need is often driven by fear. Fear of loss, fear of abandonment, fear of being alone with oneself. But choice carries something very different. It carries freedom. As Carl Jung said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. When a person learns they can stand on their own, relationships become clearer and more honest. They are no longer shaped by desperation. They are no longer built on emotional dependence. This is why true self-possession does not destroy relationships. It transforms them. A person who has learned to stand alone does not enter a relationship to be rescued from themselves. They enter with responsibility already established within. They understand that their emotional balance is their responsibility. Their self-worth is their responsibility. Their direction in life is their responsibility. Instead of expecting another person to carry these burdens, they carry them themselves. And from that foundation, a relationship becomes something healthier. Not a place of escape, but a place where two whole individuals share their lives. Not a place where one person tries to become the missing piece of another. Over time, a quiet form of confidence begins to develop. Not the kind that comes from success, achievement, or recognition, but the kind that comes from lived experience. You begin to understand that difficult emotions can be endured. Uncertainty does not break you. Loneliness passes. Rejection passes. Disappointment passes. And most importantly, you realize that your worth does not disappear when life becomes uncomfortable. This understanding slowly changes how you move through the world. Fear loses some of its power, because you have already faced many of the things you once tried to avoid. The Stoics repeatedly returned to the idea of freedom, because they understood how easily it can be surrendered without awareness. Sometimes people give it away to possessions, sometimes to status, sometimes to public opinion, sometimes even to relationships. But real freedom cannot exist when your peace depends entirely on things outside your control. The more your stability depends on external conditions, the more fragile it becomes. And the more responsibility you take for your own mind, the stronger that stability grows. Freedom is not the absence of connection. It is the absence of dependence. Eventually, a person comes to a realization that feels both simple and profound. Being single was never the goal. Being alone forever was never the goal. The real goal was wholeness. The development of enough inner stability that life is no longer organized around escaping yourself. Once that happens, everything begins to shift. Solitude is no longer frightening. It becomes valuable. Relationships are no longer necessary, they become meaningful. Choices become clearer because they are guided by principles instead of pressure. And perhaps this is the real reward hidden in the journey. You stop searching for someone to complete your life, and you begin building a life that already feels complete. From that place, love becomes a gift, not a requirement. Connection becomes an addition, not a solution. You belong to yourself first, and because of that, you are finally able to share yourself freely. That is true self-possession. That is true freedom. And once it is understood, it becomes one of the few things life cannot take away. The world will continue to tell you that fulfillment exists somewhere outside of you, that peace is waiting in the next achievement, the next relationship, or the next chapter. But the strongest foundation you will ever build is the one within. The moment you stop running from yourself and begin standing firmly in your own presence, everything changes. You no longer chase completeness. You realize it was never missing. It was always there. If this message resonated with you, don't stop here. One of the videos on your screen right now will take this journey even deeper and help you strengthen the mindset, discipline, and inner freedom that few people ever develop. Choose the one that speaks to you most and continue the path. And thank you for being part of Stoic Mind Theory, where every step inward is a step closer to becoming who you were meant to be.